You should be thinking strategic. It's not about making a knee-jerk reaction and saying, great, this tax bill is awesome. Let's just go and do it.
Welcome to the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast, brought to you by Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, where we are on a mission to help the highest caliber physicians achieve wealth that matters. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast. I'm Lauren Oschman, and I am bringing to you today an episode that you all actually requested. So last episode that we released, Kameron, Helmuth, and I, he's one of our Vestia partners, talked about the One Big Beautiful Bill and some of the tax law changes that doctors could expect in 2026 and beyond. One of the topics that we talked about was the opportunity for businesses and investors to use bonus depreciation, cost segregation studies to potentially take some pretty big tax deductions, even starting as early as 2025 with these new provisions. A lot of you requested that we do a little bit of a deeper dive into that topic, particularly as it applies to short-term rentals and other business opportunities. So I am bringing to you today a solo episode put on by Kameron Helmuth, where he is going to deep dive into some of those strategies and the nuances and details around it. So without further ado, here's Kameron. Hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Lauren. I want to talk today about some of the changes that have come through the new tax bill, specifically around depreciation and this concept of bonus depreciation. And if you're here just to learn about the short-term tax loophole, we'll talk about that. But I also don't want to ignore the fact that this is very applicable and probably used more often with our private practice owners who have their own buildings or they're buying pieces of equipment. So I think to start with a high level, what is depreciation? And as a reminder, when you're buying a piece of an asset, any kind, piece of property, something physical in your business, the IRS assumes that there is a normal usable life depending on what you buy. If you buy equipment, it's going to be obviously less years than like a piece of property or a building. What depreciation allows you to do is take a tax offset over that number of years that the IRS says it's a usable life. What we've found, though, in the past is that a lot of times to fuel business expansion, we need to incentivize business owners to want to do this, right? This is a big investment. You're putting money out there. So there's this concept of bonus depreciation that started back in the tax cuts and really accelerated some expansion because they allowed for what was called 100% bonus depreciation. So again, if you think of normal use life of, let's say, a commercial piece of property is 27 years. What they instead allow you to do is say, if you bought that property this year, you could actually take the entire thing as a write-off and depreciate the whole asset in year one. Great for your obviously future tax situation. But the problem was you're essentially taking all of your future years' deductions and pushing them into the current tax year. So that had been there for a few years. And then over the last 5 years has started to actually go down, with this most recent year being only 40% bonus depreciation. That said, if you bought something, 40% of that purchase could again be accelerated into the current year. This was a big topic of conversation because it was set to completely sunset in 2027 and be gone altogether. With the new One Big Beautiful Bill, that 100% bonus depreciation is back on the table. So this is important conversation for people, again, in private practice who are expanding their businesses, buying pieces of property, or they're buying equipment. But also we'll talk about it for real estate investors and how that can be leveraged. So again, depreciation is important as you're trying to lower your taxable income and the entity that you're using that asset for. There is some trade-offs though. So to receive bonus depreciation is pretty easy. You can take that in the first year, right? So let's say today you bought a piece of property for $1 million. I'm going to go and take that $1 million write-off against my business income that's using that property in the current year. Great for my current year taxes, right? Instead, though, what if it were actually more beneficial for me to take some bonus depreciation this year, but also then expand the other depreciation to help with future tax years? Well, there's this nifty thing called a cost segregation study that can help you identify what parts of your building, for example, can be taken as an accelerated depreciation versus what needs to be considered a 27 or longer year piece of property. So today, if I bought that $1 million property, I could hire a reputable company to come in and do a cost segregation study. They will actually walk through my building and they will say, of your building, this is infrastructure, these are windows, this is equipment, this is furniture. And they give me a nice report that says This is the property that needs to be depreciated over a longer period of time. And this is the part of the property that actually can be accelerated either into the current year or over the next 5 or 7 years. That's helpful because if I'm trying to, again, still keep some tax benefits for the future, but accelerate what makes sense into today, that gives me a very justifiable way to show this is how much I can deduct versus just writing it all off on that 100% bonus depreciation. So speaking of that, this reminds me of a story. Now, this is a hypothetical, but when I was working with a client recently, we obviously have these opportunities inside of a practice. And this physician was looking at an opportunity to buy a new building. It'd be their 4th building, for example. We're trying to add to what they already have inside the practice. We were looking at tax strategy for the year and ways to reduce current taxable income. They've been successful in the past. Their receivables are doing well. They're making more and more money. They're trying to figure out, I've made more than I expected. I'm going to owe a huge amount into these quarterly estimates over the next handful of months, but I'd rather put it to work into something that's building something for my practice and it's going to benefit me. But they've had this eye on this property for a while and thought that'd be a perfect next location for my practice. So how can I leverage that? Well, at the beginning of the year, maybe they hadn't been able to make that firm commitment, but once the tax bill had come through, we were able to talk about what would the impact of buying this property be inside of your tax situation, but also what does it do for your overall financial plan? So after some figuring out, we determined not only will this help add to the overall investment portfolio and build some passive income stream for the future, but because this is a long-term location for the property and they're still so young and owning a private practice, it made all the sense in the world to buy it, do the cost segregation study, and take that accelerated depreciation into the current year. Why would you do that? Because they're likely to bring on an associate in the next couple of years. So again, if I'm going to leverage as much as I can today, instead of sharing that benefit in the future, it made sense to lower your current taxable situation. So that's a great example of, as a private practice owner, you should be thinking strategic. It's not about making a knee-jerk reaction and saying, great, this tax bill is awesome, let's just go and do it. That same person, though, also has, let's say, a rental property. And another client in another state was in a similar situation, and they said, I've got a rental property. I've been doing long-term rental for a little while, but I've considered short-term rental, but it does make me nervous because of the volume of people in there, the cost that it comes with, and potentially the trade-offs. So we started talking about this short-term tax loophole. Again, it was not the only incentive to do or change the purpose behind this building, but it was a very strong reminder of a tax incentive in addition to what you're already trying to achieve can do that. So we went through the cost segregation study, and ideally they came back and said, you know what, this property is worth X amount. A portion of this is land. You can't depreciate land, right? So we can't accelerate that. But they said the rest of the property is worth, let's say, $2 million. Of that $2 million, you can take this much in the current year, or you can take this much over a 10-year or 5-year period. But again, this physician said, I actually want to accelerate as much as I possibly can into the current year. I don't see myself actually making more than I'm making this year because I've had a liquidity event somewhere else. I don't anticipate making this much next year. I'm in the highest tax bracket, but my normal situation is I'm in a lower tax bracket. So leveraging that accelerated depreciation into the current year made all the sense in the world for them. But as a reminder, the only reason that made sense is the rental property they purchased is intended to be a future vacation home for them in retirement. But today, they have no intention of using it and they want to pass it on to their family. So the problem is if they were to go into that with tax being the only reason they buy that property, they take the tax benefit today. Let's say 5 years from now, they sell the property. They're paying all that tax benefit right back. So again, be strategic and be thoughtful. Don't let that incentive really make the decision for you. Now, these are pretty sophisticated. And I will say that there are some companies that do them very well, but there are a lot of companies that dabble. So it's important that you start with your trusted CPA and have a referral given to you of who can do these cost segregation studies. You want it to be someone who's done this for a long time because the word of warning is right now, this is going to be a hot topic. This is similar to what we saw in employee retention credits, for example, back during COVID. There will be companies that pop up out of the woodwork and say, hey, we can do this for you, but we won't back you during an audit and we don't have the history to show good business. So start with your CPA if you feel like that's the best route. There's a strategic discussion that you need to have of whether it makes sense to take that accelerated depreciation or not. Pros and cons, of course, of everything, but the biggest thing to remember is there's no free lunch with the IRS. So if I take all my future depreciation into today, what's going to happen is in the future, if I were to sell that property that I took that depreciation on, I actually have to repay a lot of that back. So again, if it's something that is intended to be for business today, and let's say you're in a higher income tax bracket, that still might make sense to accelerate into current tax years. But talk with your CPA, talk with your advisor, because there is some strategic planning that can come into what makes the most sense. Now, on the flip side, if you aren't a private practice owner, this can also be leveraged in things like real estate investing. There's a really, really popular strategy that is all over YouTube, and you hear about it on Instagram, called the short-term rental loophole. This is a very hot topic. We get questions often from clients or prospective clients, and it all sounds like upside. It all sounds exciting and enticing. They don't tell you all the nuance. And I'll give you an example. So in a situation where we were helping a client, and let's say, they found a property in another state, not even close to them, but they said, hey, the rental market is so strong. And I think if I were to go out and buy this, I could make X amount. I could get a really huge tax benefit. But you know what? I'm going to do this every single year for the next 10 years until I retire. I'll have an awesome portfolio. And then in retirement, I'll just start selling those back out and I'll live off of all the appreciation in the property. Sounded like an amazing opportunity until we had to really dive deep into the nuance, which is you do get those tax benefits today. It does help offset not only your rental property income, but also potentially earned income. But they didn't realize, number one, you have to be materially involved. Well, this person is a busy surgeon. They don't have the time, nor could they ever argue the fact that they have enough hours in the day as a surgeon to also be a real estate professional. That's very, very challenging. So they were thinking, I'll get a property manager and I'll let them do it. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, in the future, if you remember, we talk about, if you went to sell that property in the future, at some point, you do have to repay those. So if you're only doing it for the incentive today, not realizing that on the back end, you're going to be paying it back. By the way, that's probably just coming from the proceeds of you selling, because if you're in retirement and start doing that, as I was explaining to this client, you don't even have earned income anymore to help pay for that tax obligation. So there is some benefit still today, but it always has to be balanced. So what we ultimately figured out for them was, maybe the answer isn't buying 10 properties over the next 10 years. Maybe the answer is, let's find one or two properties that really matter. So for example, they said, well, I love vacationing here. Okay. How often do you spend time there? Maybe a week or two a year. Okay. What other locations do you love to travel to? So we identified 2 spots around the country, and we said, if you go to those locations, find a property that makes sense over the next handful of years, even if you spend more money to get it, it still might make sense. We said, if you can go and stay there 14 days or less while you're there, and then average those under 7 days for the other renters, that is going to be the most impactful. And by the way, they're places you already love to go. So in the future, even if, let's say, you chose to sell one, but keep the other, they're in a location that means something to you. So there's a dual benefit of not only the tax write-offs, not only the appreciation and passive income, but you also get something that you wanted to have anyways. So at a very high level, if I were to go out today and just buy a regular piece of property and do a long-term rental, let's say I find a tenant, they're renting for me month by month, that is considered passive income. Because if I'm a physician, I can't obviously say that that is my active trade. I don't do that day to day. So it's passive income. The problem is I can only take passive losses against that passive income. So if I'm a W-2 physician making a very high income, I can only offset as much as my rental income actually brings in. So it's helpful, but it's not ideal. Inside of the short-term rental space, and that's your Airbnbs, your VRBOs, if your rental averages 7 days or less throughout the year, you can actually classify that as active income if you meet certain requirements. There's a number of tests that can be passed, but the most important one is you have some active participation of a certain number of hours per year, and it's more than anybody else. So again, if you're hiring a property manager and delegating all that responsibility, you're going to have a very hard time justifying that. But here's an example that has worked practically with my own clients. Let's say you have a working spouse and a non-working spouse. If that non-working spouse can bear the brunt of responsibility for that piece of property, it could be pretty easy to justify that as you are actively involved. It is way less stringent than what you'd consider a real estate professional, if you've heard that term. That has a number of requirements that, frankly, as any physician, is not realistic to meet. So let's assume you have a short-term rental. Let's assume then you're averaging 7 days or less on that rental. You can take that cost segregation study or that depreciation that we talk about. Not only can you use the losses against the income from that piece of property, you could also apply it towards your other earned income because that's now an active investment. So if I have more losses in my rental property than what I make in income, I can now apply that to my W-2. Very, very impactful and one of the most influential practices for a W-2 physician to help lower your taxable income. So if that were to happen, there are some nuances, right? Again, no free lunch. You have to meet the requirements. It has to be a short-term rental. There's also a caveat that if you personally use that, and let's say if it's more than 14 days a year, anything beyond that, you start to lose part of the benefits. You might still get them, but they start to reduce proportionally. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't stay 6 months a year in this property, rent it the other 6 months, get completely tax-free income, and offset your W-2. There's some trade-offs there. But the big thing to remember is that depreciation is real. So I would encourage you, if you're out there thinking, I'm just going to go buy a piece of property to get the current year tax benefit, remember, if you go and sell that 5 years from now, you're eventually going to have to repay that. So I think this is very, very impactful for people who are buying long-term rental properties to keep inside of their portfolio. That is something that could 100% be applicable to you. And it's important to understand that there's additional benefits if you're thinking, I want a rental, but should I do long or short-term rental? The other thing to keep in mind, though, obviously short-term rental does have some additional trade-offs. Things like, you know what, you're going to have more people living in that house and probably a little bit more upkeep or damages that you might have to keep to. So, and there's more management, right? If you're managing multiple reservations a month versus somebody as a long-term leaseholder. So a lot of benefit can come with these rental strategies, but just keep in mind that you're doing it for the right reasons. You don't buy a rental property. I've yet to find a real estate investor that said, I bought it for the money and I've loved owning it ever since. That is not the right way to go into this. You go into it trying to build some equity in a future investment. You get some passive income, maybe some additional tax benefits, but it's part of an overall investment strategy. It's not just a, hey, I'm making a rash decision to get a tax break today. It's a good reminder, again, a portfolio. I hear this all the time, and this is what they talk about is, building these real estate portfolios and having completely tax-free income and, offsetting your W-2. It's 100% legitimate if done the right way and for the right reasons. But for the wrong reasons, the IRS will catch you. You'll get in trouble, and it's very easy to get allured by this, but please make sure you're asking the right questions and doing it intentionally, because I think it's smarter to do one or two of these with the right purpose behind it and benefit from that versus just chasing the next tax incentive out there. So a lot going into this. I think the good news is, again, if you're listening, depreciation is real and bonus depreciation is back. I think it is important, though, to understand the nuance behind it and that it's not right for everybody. Again, an example would be a recent young surgeon who is buying into a practice, bought the piece of real estate this year, but they still have a senior partner involved. They're going to be the ones that have higher and higher earned income over the next 10 years, taking all that bonus depreciation today so that her current partner and herself take all of the tax benefit might not make as much sense as stretching that out over a 5 or 10 year period so that she gets an equalized tax benefit, but we're not overly benefiting the exiting partner. So it's all around how you should strategize and what makes the most sense for your situation. But please start with understanding how they work. Do not do it on your own. Ask for trusted guidance from your advisor, from your CPA. Work with trusted professionals if you do go the route of a cost segregation study. And again, understand that there are always pros and cons of everything. And before you go into making that decision or buying that property or making an expansion in your business, understand the incentives, but also understand the trade-offs.
Are you looking to hire a financial advisor with physician-specific expertise?
At Vestia, we work exclusively with doctors, helping you navigate things like student loan repayment, reviewing RVU-based contracts, navigating practice buy-ins or private equity offers, optimizing retirement plans, designing tax-smart investment strategies, and planning for things like parental leave or early retirement. We have over 150 years of combined experience working with specialized physicians. So chances are, if you're thinking about it, we've helped another doctor through it. We built our firm around one goal: helping physicians achieve wealth that matters. Planning that's not just about numbers, but about designing the life you actually want to live. That means your wealth lets you live the life you imagined when you first started this journey. Time with your family, freedom in your schedule, and confidence in your decisions. Not sure how you're doing today? Head to vestiaadvisors.com/DEO, that's DEO for Doctor's Eyes Only, to take our 3-minute Physician Wealth Checkup and get a snapshot of where you stand today and what to do next. Thank you for listening to the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast. We hope today's conversation advanced your journey to wealth that matters. Please make sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss a single one of our amazing episodes we have coming up. See you next time. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Vestia Advisors, LLC. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. It should not be construed as legal or tax advice and is not intended to replace the advice of a qualified attorney or tax advisor. This information is not an offer or a solicitation to buy or sell securities. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Before investing, you should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses associated with investment products. Investment decisions should be based on an individual's own goals, time horizon, and tolerance for risk. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Diversification and asset allocation do not ensure a profit or guarantee against loss. Consult your financial professional before making any investments. Investment advisory services offered through Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, Vestia Retirement Plan Consultants, and Vestia Advisors, LLC. Securities offered through Osdale Financial Partners, Inc., 5187 Utica Ridge Road, Davenport, Iowa, 52807. Member, FINRA, SIPC. Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, Vestia Retirement Plan Consultants, Vestia Advisors, LLC, and Osdale Financial Partners, Inc. are independently owned and operated.